The document was reportedly signed before dawn. According to sources said to be familiar with the internal briefings at Windsor Castle, a custody framework tied to royal status, security entitlements, and future titles was quietly formalized under the authority of King Charles III, and within hours the narrative detonated. What had been framed publicly as a stabilizing compromise between estranged branches of the House of Windsor allegedly transformed into an accusation so explosive that senior advisers began using language not heard since the abdication crisis. Because mere hours after the ink dried, Prince Harry reportedly confronted palace intermediaries with claims that stunned even seasoned constitutional operatives. In what one insider described as a procedural ambush, he allegedly accused Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew of actions he characterized as institutionally indefensible, actions that, if substantiated, could carry ramifications extending far beyond family grievance and into the machinery of royal governance itself. The public was told this was about stability, about the welfare of children, about continuity. But according to those who claim knowledge of the late-night consultations, the custody agreement was reportedly tethered to broader constitutional instruments, security classifications, domicile designations, and potential title contingencies that intersect with the enduring force of the letters patent 1917. And once accusations entered the record, even informally, the implications allegedly escalated into questions that brushed dangerously close to the authority of the sovereign. Because within the monarchy, nothing is ever just personal. When allegations invoke a working royal, a non-working royal, and a figure long shadowed by controversy, it ceases to be a family disagreement. It becomes a structural stress test of the crown. And as the palace reportedly scrambled to contain the fallout, whispers began circulating that an emergency consult with the Privy Council was no longer theoretical, but imminent. If the emergency consultations were indeed initiated, they were not symbolic. Sources allegedly briefed on the internal response suggest that advisors surrounding King Charles III began quietly mapping the constitutional levers available to the sovereign, tools rarely discussed publicly but embedded within centuries of precedent. At the center of those discussions reportedly was the enduring authority of the Crown to issue, amend, or reinterpret status through mechanisms akin to the letters patent 1917, a document that historically defined who may carry the style of Royal Highness and under what conditions. Because if accusations cross from personal grievance into reputational endangerment of the institution, the palace does not respond emotionally, it responds structurally. Insiders claim that senior legal minds explored whether custody frameworks tied to domicile, security classification, and royal designation could be recalibrated under sovereign authority. Not revoked, recalibrated. There is a difference. Revocation invites spectacle. Recalibration operates in silence. At issue allegedly was whether statements attributed to Prince Harry, particularly those implicating both Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew, triggered a reputational exposure clause buried within advisory memoranda drafted during prior crises. While such clauses are rarely acknowledged publicly, constitutional historians note that the monarchy's strength lies not in public defense, but in procedural containment, and containment requires leverage. One reportedly discussed option involved invoking the advisory authority of the Privy Council to review the intersection between custody, security eligibility, and royal representation abroad. Another more drastic pathway allegedly considered whether the sovereign could quietly redefine the operational scope of non-working royals without parliamentary confrontation, an act that would not punish but strategically diminish. Because within the architecture of the crown, status is oxygen. Remove the oxygen slowly and the room changes before anyone realizes they are suffocating. But constitutional tools are only deployed when evidence exists to justify them. And according to those claiming proximity to the unfolding drama, evidence, financial, communicative, and procedural, was already being compiled, and that is where the story becomes far more dangerous. What transformed concern into alarm, sources say, was not the accusation itself, but the paper trail allegedly attached to it. According to individuals described as having indirect knowledge of internal briefings, A series of communications and financial alignments were flagged during routine compliance reviews tied to the custody framework. These were not criminal files, they were not court exhibits. They were reportedly advisory memoranda, quiet compilations meant to assess reputational risk exposure within the Crown's extended network. But within those documents, allegedly, were references to overlapping contractual interests, shared intermediaries, and coordinated narrative strategies that raised institutional eyebrows. At the center of the concern was the claim by Prince Harry that certain decisions surrounding custody, security eligibility, and symbolic royal access were not merely bureaucratic outcomes, but strategically influenced. Influenced, he reportedly suggested, by a convergence of interests between Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew that he characterized as operationally misaligned with the Crown. The phrase was chilling because within royal governance, misalignment is often code for reputational threat. Sources allege that financial reviews linked to estate management structures, some with historical ties to properties such as Sandringham House, revealed advisory overlaps between private representatives. No wrongdoing was formally declared, no charges were filed, but the optics insiders reportedly warned were combustible, particularly when viewed against the backdrop of prior controversies. What made the situation even more volatile, according to palace watchers, was timing. The custody agreement had been signed under assurances of stability. Stability requires trust, and trust in institutional terms requires transparency. Instead, officials allegedly found themselves confronting fragmented disclosures and selective communications, patterns that, while not illegal, could be interpreted as strategically incomplete. And then came the deadline, because buried within the custody framework, sources say, was a compliance review window, a narrow period in which all parties were required to affirm disclosure accuracy and financial independence parameters. Miss that window and the framework could be reopened, and once reopened, it would not remain a private family matter. The compliance window, according to sources reportedly briefed on the framework, was not ceremonial. It was procedural and unforgiving. Within 30 days of the custody agreement's execution, all parties were allegedly required to submit affirmations tied to financial independence, advisory relationships, and security eligibility disclosures. On paper, it was routine governance. In reality, insiders claim it functioned as a pressure chamber because once disclosures are certified, they become institutional representations. And misrepresentation, even unintentional, invites review. Advisors close to King Charles III are said to have emphasized that the window was not designed to punish, but to protect the Crown's operational integrity. Yet as the days reportedly passed, tension escalated behind the walls of Windsor Castle. Communications slowed, clarifications were requested, certain affirmations, sources allege, arrived incomplete. Incomplete is not illegal, but incomplete is combustible, especially when accusations have already entered the bloodstream of the institution. According to palace observers, the concern was not merely about financial overlap or advisory coordination. It was about narrative control. If external commercial agreements intersected with royal symbolism, titles, access, security protocols, then the custody deal risked being perceived not as a child-centered framework, but as a leverage instrument. And leverage inside a monarchy is dangerous, because the monarchy does not operate on contracts alone. It operates on perception. As the compliance deadline approached, insiders claimed that quiet contingency plans were drafted. If disclosures failed verification thresholds, the palace could allegedly trigger a structured review under advisory council, potentially involving the Privy Council. That would not be a public trial, it would be an internal recalibration. But recalibration has consequences. And those consequences would not be limited to custody parameters. They could touch legacy, inheritance optics, and long-term positioning within the line of succession orbit, even indirectly, which is when the crisis reportedly shifted from procedural to generational, because this was no longer just about documents. It was about what kind of monarchy survives the next decade and who carries its moral weight. By insiders' accounts, the crisis now cut through the core of the House of Windsor itself. The custody agreement, once thought to be a stabilizing compromise, had allegedly triggered what sources describe as a legacy dilemma, a collision of moral authority, symbolic inheritance, and intergenerational expectations. At the center, King Charles III, reportedly weighing institutional precedent against personal obligation. Every move carried symbolic weight because in monarchy, perception is legislation. Sources claim that attention turned immediately to physical and symbolic assets tied to succession and memory. The vaults of Sandringham House, private estates historically earmarked for family continuity, and documents codifying privileges derived from letters patent 1917. Allegedly, advisors warned that leaving any ambiguity could allow actors to reinterpret their authority, potentially altering how future generations view the crown's legitimacy. The moral calculus insiders suggest was as complex as the legal one. Prince William reportedly found himself navigating a delicate balance between supporting his father and shielding his children from institutional turbulence. Meanwhile, Prince Harry was said to be exerting pressure through both formal channels and behind-the-scenes communications, allegedly amplifying the perception that the monarchy's authority was contested, not ceremonial. This was not merely about titles or security access. Allegedly, it became a question of inheritance, both tangible and intangible, estates, ceremonial roles, and even the continuity of symbolic royal traditions were suddenly part of a chessboard. And according to palace insiders, any misstep could delegitimize carefully constructed custodial agreements, leaving legacy and reputation at risk simultaneously. As the family grappled with competing obligations, loyalty, transparency, and legacy, sources claim that whispers of strategic countermoves were circulating both within official advisory channels and in informal communications. The sense of inevitability reportedly hung heavy. Decisions would not just affect the immediate household, they could reshape perceptions of the crown for decades. And as the palace considered the next step, one truth reportedly crystallized. To protect institutional authority, a calculated response was now required, a response that, insiders warn, could involve maneuvering as precise and cold as any historical succession crisis. The stage was set. The moves would now be deliberate, strategic, and potentially devastating. Sources say that within the inner circle of King Charles III, a series of strategic countermoves was reportedly deployed with surgical precision. Every advisory memo, every back-channel communication was allegedly designed not to inflame, but to recalibrate the balance of authority, preserve institutional credibility, and contain reputational risk before it metastasized beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. One purported tactic involved redefining operational privileges tied to non-working royals. According to sources familiar with internal deliberations, this meant that Prince Andrew could see his ceremonial engagements subtly restricted, while security and estate access for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle could be linked directly to compliance with the newly reinforced covenants, both custodial and financial. The message, insiders claim, was unmistakable. Authority derives from alignment with institutional norms. At the same time, sources allege that advisors implemented measures to shore up narrative control. Strategic communications were reportedly drafted for potential leaks, ensuring that if allegations reached the press, they could be contextualized within the framework of institutional preservation rather than personal vendetta. Legal counsel, it is said, prepared contingency briefs referencing historical precedent, including clauses derived from letters patent 1917, effectively codifying both consequence and rationale. The countermoves, according to palace watchers, extended to symbolic assets as well. Estates, archival access, and ceremonial roles were recalibrated in ways that reinforced the crown's moral authority while preserving the illusion of family harmony. Even small gestures, a redirected correspondence, a postponed public appearance, were reportedly intended to convey stability to both domestic observers and foreign diplomatic channels. However, insiders warn that strategic measures, while methodical, carried inherent risk. Every recalibration could trigger retaliatory maneuvers, misinterpretation, or leaks, and those risks were compounded by the intertwined financial and symbolic interests of the parties involved. The palace reportedly confronted a stark reality. Authority had to be defended not with words alone, but through deliberate structural action. And the next escalation, sources claim, would hit where power meets pressure, finance, and resources. According to insiders, the palace's strategic recalibrations were only half the equation. The other half, sources say, involved a subtle but potent application of financial and logistical pressure, tools that operate quietly but decisively in institutional power plays. Reports suggest that advisors scrutinized all estate-related expenditures tied to non-working royals, including security allocations, private travel, and operational budgets for both Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Allegedly, certain privileges were temporarily frozen or reclassified, creating a scenario where access to key resources depended directly on adherence to compliance deadlines and institutional expectations. Even minor delays in reporting or transparency could trigger suspension of allowances, insiders claim, making the pressure both procedural and personal. Estate management structures, particularly those linked to Sandringham House and Windsor Castle, were reportedly evaluated for resource realignment. Sources say that logistics, staffing, and ceremonial allocations were subtly adjusted, creating an operational bottleneck that underscored the consequences of non-compliance without igniting public controversy. The message, palace watchers assert, was clear. Misalignment with crown expectations carries tangible ramifications. Financial exposure extended beyond estates. Sources allege that contracts linked to security firms, private advisors, and estate administrators were scrutinized for dependency risk, ensuring that the central authority retained leverage over external actors who might inadvertently amplify reputational exposure. Even seemingly routine costs, maintenance schedules, travel reimbursements, and private staff allocation were leveraged as mechanisms to reinforce accountability. But the psychological impact, insiders warn, was equally critical. By constraining resources, the palace reportedly induced a controlled sense of urgency, isolation, and vulnerability, strategic pressure that could influence decision-making without public spectacle. It was a calculated siege, subtle, relentless, and deeply felt. And as financial and operational constraints intensified, the palace reportedly recognized that the next phase was inevitable: the human toll. The stress, paranoia, and isolation of these high-stakes pressures would shape behavior and force choices that could not be undone. Sources claim that the cumulative weight of institutional pressure, restricted resources, and looming compliance deadlines began to manifest as a psychological siege for the central figures involved. Allegedly, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were increasingly isolated from traditional channels of support, while advisors reportedly funneled communication strategically, ensuring that every decision felt consequential. According to palace insiders, even minor missteps, delayed document submissions, unclear financial disclosures, or ambiguous statements were amplified internally, creating a climate of heightened scrutiny. It was reportedly a system designed not to intimidate personally, but to expose the fragility of control when perception and compliance are misaligned. Every interaction, every message, every public gesture became data for evaluators, observers, and internal counsel. The isolation, sources allege, intensified the stakes. With resources constrained and communications monitored, the accused parties were reportedly forced to make choices under duress, weighing personal motives against the potential for reputational or institutional fallout. Allegedly, the palace leveraged both emotional and operational pressure points, subtle withdrawals of privileges, careful reallocation of ceremonial roles, and the omnipresent reminder of legacy obligations to shape behavior without overt confrontation. Observers familiar with internal briefings reportedly describe a climate of calculated tension. Allegations, accusations, and procedural checks converged to form a siege that was as much about perception as enforcement. The human element became inseparable from institutional strategy. Fatigue, uncertainty, and the threat of narrative loss were weaponized quietly, yet with enduring impact. And as the psychological strain reportedly mounted, sources say the palace recognized that a final moral reckoning was imminent. The stage was set for a decisive judgment, not merely on compliance or loyalty or inheritance, but on the principles that define the crown itself. The next step, insiders claim, would deliver both institutional clarity and a message that the monarchy operates above personal grievance, guided by legacy, law, and unyielding authority. As sources reportedly confirm, the palace now approached what insiders describe as the final stage: moral judgment and the assertion of institutional authority. Allegedly, King Charles III faced a choice that transcended personal reconciliation. It was a moment that defined precedent, legacy, and the continuity of the crown. Every action taken, every privilege recalibrated, and every statement crafted in the weeks prior converged toward a singular imperative: preserve the monarchy's integrity above all else. According to those claiming knowledge of the inner deliberations, the moral framework guiding this judgment was layered. It combined legal precedent from Letters Patent 1917, institutional safeguards via the Privy Council, and the intangible yet potent authority of family legacy. The message reportedly transmitted throughout Windsor's corridors was unmistakable. Loyalty, transparency, and alignment with institutional norms are non-negotiable. Deviations may carry personal consequence, but more critically, they endanger the structure of monarchy itself. Sources allege that in the final deliberations, compliance, narrative control, and financial alignment were evaluated not merely as procedural obligations but as moral tests. Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and Prince Andrew were reportedly presented with choices that measured fidelity to the crown against personal ambition and grievance. Those choices, insiders warn, would reverberate beyond family dynamics, influencing public perception, diplomatic trust, and historical interpretation for generations. For the audience observing from outside, the implications are stark. Allegedly, this crisis illustrates that the monarchy is more than a lineage. It is an institution governed by principle, protocol, and precedents. Privilege carries responsibility. Access carries accountability. And loyalty carries consequence. As this high-stakes drama unfolds, palace watchers suggest one undeniable truth: the crown endures not by avoiding conflict, but by channeling it into structures that protect legacy, authority, and stability. Allegedly, those who misalign with those structures risk not only personal setback, but the historical weight of precedent itself. For viewers, the lesson resonates beyond the headlines. In institutions where legacy and authority intersect, decisions echo far longer than any individual life. Observe, analyze, and recognize that even within the gilded walls of Windsor, every move has consequence. I am not a licensed investment advisor, nor am I presenting verified court findings. This narrative is based on reported insider claims and public historical reference, intended for dramatic and analytical insight into unfolding royal events.